me to speak today. It's a very exciting company to be in. When I was first asked, Dino asked me to talk about a paper or some work that I published in 2016 around competency-based assessment. And it's kind of been a few years, so I kind of shifted that a little bit to kind of be more of a comparison of different experiences. So what I'm going to talk about today is not so much on the research elements of this, but more about a comparison of the different processes that I've kind of gone through and how they all related to competency-based assessment. But before I go into that, the first thing I'd like to do is to actually get you to have a think and think about this in your own context, whether it's a lab that you coordinate, labs that you've taught before, universities that you're at. What do you specifically want to get out of a lab program? And I know that Stephen already touched on this in the first talk, and they did the big survey of across academics, students, teaching assistants to kind of see that general pool. But I think it's really interesting if you go from that large perspective and down to an individual in one particular context, it can be quite different. And there are important subtleties in terms of what the academic hopes their students to develop through a first year course. And also then what the students are thinking they're developing out of that. And even just quickly seeing Joy Walker's and Katie Hosbin's poster at the start where they use argument-driven inquiry. It's in another set of learning outcomes entirely from what I'll be talking about today. So first of all, what is competency-based assessment? If you haven't come across the term before, I know Stephen mentioned it earlier, but it's the idea that we establish a set of competencies, and in most cases, it's treated as a once you are able to do the thing, you have done the thing and you tick it off. And you can continually assess these or formatively assess these as you go through, but rather than assessing someone on 50 out of 100 or 75 out of 100, it's pass or fail, you've accomplished what you want to develop. And I'm going to talk about 3 examples. So the first will be University of Tasmania, which was where the study I mentioned earlier was done. Then I did a stint of work at UNSW, University of New South Wales, and they had a different system with some similarities, but kind of coming from a different direction. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're looking at doing at USyd, and it is still a little bit ambiguous as to what we'll exactly do. I'll give you an idea of the general gist. And a lot of this work, particularly the first study that I looked at, it was kind of based off of these 2 papers that I kind of encountered at the time. So there was the work by Naomi and Michael and published in JCE, and that was looking at using digital badges in high school chemistry. And then there was also the work by the Towns group in a similar sort of space, looking at these digital badges. And I won't go too much into that, but this idea of attributing badges to particular skills and awarding those as a way to get students to recognize what they're developing. And also treat it as you've done the thing, here it is, rather than a grade out of a particular number. Now, particularly, I suppose, if you're shifting into a chemistry education space, or if you're recently a new academic and you're exposed to this area, there's often a temptation to jump on the latest big trend, to find that flavor of the month and to adopt that, because you'll read this paper and it was fantastic work and they showed really positive outcomes, which, let's face it, most of the papers we see are typically positive in nature. But there's that moment where you need to really think, does it actually meet your intended laboratory learning outcomes? Like, what are the skills or what are the competencies you want students to develop and then demonstrate through that course? To use the example again, to employ something like argument-driven inquiry may not be appropriate when your focus may just be on developing hands-on skills. And you want to focus on that instead of something like developing argumentative skills or critical thinking skills. Now, the first one is the University of Tasmania, and this is work between myself, Alex December, and Stuart Thickett. And when we went into this, the problem that we kind of, I suppose what we wanted our lab program to achieve was kind of in 2 main areas. We wanted to develop these core practical skills and techniques, and we wanted to try and reinforce and extend concepts in the classroom. So we wanted to keep that connection between the laboratory and the lecture content there, even if it was just tenuously. And the issues that we kind of identified, and a large justification as to why we wanted to do this, was that, and speak from my personal experience when I was demonstrating in these labs for 5 or 6 years, students focused almost exclusively on getting a good grade. There was no recognition of the skills. They didn't think about the content. They're like, how do I get my 100% because I need to get good grades in this. And it didn't matter that a lab was worth less than 1% of their final marks. They're like, have to get 100. So there was no recognition of skills. It was a very low priority. And this was very evident at second year, which is where Alex and Stuart were particularly interested, is that they had to reteach all of these second year students the skills again. And this is by no means an isolated problem. And you will see some similarities between these three cases. So our interpretation of how we would address this is that we developed these 11 competencies. And we developed them to be somewhat broad. As you can see here, I've listed them, but I won't go through them in great detail. But rather than taking a badge approach of saying a titration skill or using this particular piece of equipment skill, we wanted to have these broad categories that for each experiment, we could then say this competency for this experiment looks like this. And that was a way that we could, for each experiment, say, you know, competencies 1, 4, 5, and 8 are being looked at in this lab. And this is what you want to be looking at as you go through. And to kind of group these together, we had a combination of laboratory specific skills, which was hitting that target of wanting to develop the hands-on skills they need to go into second year. We had some of the chemistry content knowledge. Sorry, my mouse is just having a moment. We had some of the chemistry content knowledge that we wanted to keep there. So tenuously keeping that connection. UTAS happens to be a somewhat difficult to bring around big changes. So therefore we had to keep that content involved. And then some of those transferable skills that Stephen mentioned earlier as well. So the skills that are transferable outside of the laboratory between different disciplines, treated as the kind of graduate qualities that we want all graduates to develop and demonstrate. Now, I won't go into much more detail than that because I am on a time schedule. But one thing I will say is that all three of these examples have had positive outcomes. So we've seen positive outcomes from students, demonstrators, and we've achieved what we're after. And the real focus here for me is our mindset going in, and then the way that, or the interpretation of how we've applied competency-based assessment to that. Now, when I looked at, when I joined UNSW, this was a project that was already kind of established, and it was led by Ron Haynes and Scott Selway, two academics still on staff there. And they had a different interpretation. So they'd had a similar problem, and there was even conversations between the first year coordinator at UNSW and UTAS. And what they came up with was this idea of a lab skills portfolio. So when they wanted to go into this, they wanted to have an emphasis on practical skills. So they wanted to be like, these are the skills that you need to develop for lab purposes. And then they really wanted to focus on transparency for students. So they wanted to make sure that when a student went into a laboratory, they could see a very clear-cut list of this is what you need to show me during this laboratory. And the problems that they had, I've kept this in the form that they describe them, because I think it's an interesting difference in mindset. We very much looked at it as, here are the problems that we've already established and wanted to fix. Whereas UNSW took a perspective of almost an exploratory perspective, where they've said, well, does the assessment that we use reflect how a student performs in the laboratory class? How do we know if a student has learned the skills that we're trying to teach in the laboratory class? Are they aware of these skills? And how do they remove the ambiguity in the assessment process? So by asking questions rather than establishing the issue, there was a certain amount of, they could adapt their model as they were going through, depending on what they kind of found from that. And the form for which they took to address this, or the approach that they had, is they actually established a much more fine-grained set of skills. And a big difference was that they then established this idea of, on the left, you can see core skills. So the skills that they considered essential. Students must be able to do these, and they must be able to demonstrate these. And then non-core skills, where we would like you to develop these and to demonstrate these, but your passing of this unit does not hinge on those skills. And the way that they then assessed this was different to ours. So UTAS, we looked at assessing the competency per experiment, and we give them a pass-fail if they succeeded. But in this particular case, they actually separated their assessment for the different types of skills. So core skills, they treated in a pass-fail mode, in a traditional kind of competency-based. Were you safe in the laboratory? Tick. Did you act in an ethical manner around your peers? Tick. And these were assessed multiple times through a range of different experiments. And the idea was that if you didn't succeed in one week, you were given opportunities to succeed in other weeks. The key difference then was that these non-core skills were then were a form of merit assessment. And by that, I mean that they were graded out of 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. So they came up with this kind of, you can see a radial chart here with this idea of, in this particular case, they've succeeded really well in time management, but they've done quite poorly in their chemical calculations. So it was a way for students as they went through the course to kind of get some feedback as to areas that they're excelling in, or areas they need to perhaps focus on as they kind of keep going through these. Now, the third example that I want to talk about was what we're doing at UCID currently. And this is kind of why the shape of my talk changed, was because what we're doing now, and what Stephen's obviously driving this as the lab director at first year, but my input and advice around this is kind of based off of my experiences in the other two cases that I've been in. And it's an idea of trying to blend both of these assessments together, but in a different way to which UNSW have done it. Because at the end of the day, those non-core skills are still a set of competencies, but they're being assessed in a merit way, and assessed as competencies in each experiment. So I've only listed Steve and myself here, but there is, of course, as Steve said, a large number of people who have input towards this and are involved in this. And it's not just at the academic level, it's very much up and downwards as well. So you talk about the professional staff, the students involved in teaching, as well as, you know, your leaderships up above. But when we think about what do we want our lab program to achieve, it's this idea of technical and transferable skills, so quite similar to the other two. But then very much Stephen's influence is this idea of bringing in more authentic tasks and more authentic assessment processes. What are the kinds of things that people would be measured on post being graduated and going out into the workforce? And then transparency, and here I'll note that it's transparency not just for students, but also for markers. There's a very clear idea on both ends of the table as to what do students need to think about going in, what do they need to demonstrate, and then for markers to know exactly what are the skills that they are trying to facilitate the development of. And the issues that we identified that we wanted to try and address was this idea that there was very limited understanding of the purpose of the laboratory program, and this was widespread, but particularly talking to students, having talked to some of the third year students, they said that it didn't really click until third year, was when they really started to kind of recognize what they were capable of doing and what areas they could apply different skills that they had picked up earlier. And you start thinking, aha, I learned that in second year, but I'd never really thought about that or being applied in a particular context. The other one was that students very much don't feel prepared for higher years. So I'm the incoming second year lab director, so I've had a bit to do with that in the last year. And you see a lot of students in that first few weeks, first semester of second year, where they're just very unsure of their skills. They're very unsure of what they need to be doing. And they're very reliant on their demonstrators to tell them, you've actually already done this. You just need to apply this again in a new experiment. And the kind of form that we're looking at, doing this is to kind of take this badging approach, where we have these badges to target and highlight skill development, but then to also look at some possible summative merit-based assessment tasks as well. So this might take the form of writing reports for companies or for supervisors, or it might even be practical exams. And I've accidentally put practical exams twice there. But it's the idea of separating the two together. So you may have some experiments that are focused purely on these badged systems, and then a practical exam at the end, or a report writing as a summative task towards the end of the lab program. So thinking then about my takeaways from this experience, the really key thing for me is not so much the success of what you might see in a particular study or a particular project. It's all about the context for which it was done in. And then when we think about that, how does it then apply to your own context? How can you modify that towards it? And another really key area for me is getting people on board. So it's not just about getting approval from your colleagues who teach into the course or the lab directors. It's also about talking to the professional staff and the teaching assistants, because at the end of the day, the teaching assistants have spent many more hours in the lab with their students than the coordinator would have done. for most of the larger institutes. I know small institutes tend to vary a bit. And while we have very similar courses between universities, we think about a first year chemistry course, a Gen Chem course, they tend to not change between universities, but their lab learning outcomes can be very different from one another. And then we have to think again, how does that change going beyond first year? And how does that change the learning outcomes that we're after in the laboratory? So I suppose to wrap up, because I know I've gone a couple of minutes over, when we think about what do we want to get out of the laboratory program, potentially competency-based assessment could achieve this. But I think it's really important to have an open mind as to what other laboratory models are out there that can then perhaps achieve the learning outcomes that you want, because none of them are wrong or right. It's just a matter of what is suitable for your particular context. Acknowledgements for those I've already listed, plus of course Dino and Michael for organising this event and inviting me, and that'll do.